Welcome to Get Your Spirit in Shape, United Methodist Communications and UMC.org's podcast to help keep our souls as healthy as our bodies. I'm Joe Iovino. In this episode, we're talking about the spiritual discipline of generosity. To get us started, I talked to 3 leaders in the church about how they tell others about generosity.
When we live from a place of scarcity, when we are worried about all the things that we have, or do we have enough security, when we're living from there, it's hard for us to be generous because we're so focused on all the things that we don't have.
God is so generous to us, we should respond to God out of a grateful heart. Generosity and gratitude go hand in hand.
But when you come to understand all that you are in Christ, the fullness of being part of the family of God, you begin to operate from a place of worthiness. So you operate from a place of fullness. You operate from a place of love, complete love.
We want people to experience the joy of generosity. We want people to be able to follow Wesley's admonition of make a lot, save a lot, and give a lot.
Now let's get right to the interview with Ken Sloane. I'm here today with the Reverend Ken Sloane, Director of Stewardship and Connectional Ministries with Discipleship Ministries of the United Methodist Church. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, it's fun to kind of reconnect. You and I knew each other back in New Jersey. We have this weird connection of we both served at different times for the same senior pastor. I was with Norm Skank, who's one of my mentors, in Middletown, and you were with him in, was it Lakewood?
In Lakewood. Back in, when I was a youth minister, I had the opportunity to work with him for 2 years, and he was one of my mentors as well, and just a great, solid pastor, good preacher, great pastor's heart, and that's the kind of thing you hope for when you start in a ministry, that you get to work with somebody like that. And
I remember feeling like I learned all of the things they don't teach you in seminary from Norm.
Yeah, he's very practical, very kind of down to earth, and those are the things you really need as you start out. So I miss him a lot, but he's watching over both of us, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And both of us traveling separate paths for quite some time, and then here we are, find ourselves both in Nashville.
Yeah.
And you are the Director of Stewardship and Connectional Ministries. Can you tell me what that job entails?
Sure. It's really it's a combination of 2 positions that were formerly around there. Director of Stewardship. At one point, Discipleship Ministries, we had a whole staff of people doing stewardship. But I work with a couple of different constituencies. I work with local church leaders in the areas of both finance and stewardship, and I try to resource both. I also work with a lot of our United Methodist foundations, because many of them do a lot of work with local churches around stewardship and generosity and encouraging that. So they're a pretty key constituent. But then when I was in New Jersey, at the last part of my ministry in New Jersey, I was a director of Connectional Ministries. And that's an office in the church that folks may not be aware of, but it kind of has responsibility for a lot of the programmatic mission work that the conferences do. And Discipleship Ministries kind of offers support to that group across the global church.
Oh, wow.
And so I have that as a second kind of component. While I was here at Communications, I did a lot of workshops around helping tell people who sit in our pews about what our generosity that we do as connected United Methodists, the impact it has around the world. And I was able to travel all over the country. I tell people I've done workshops in every state except Hawaii. And if you're out there from Hawaii, I'm open to invitations, talking about the difference that United Methodists make in the way we give together and give connectionally. So I kind of embrace that still in my stewardship role, even though it still is a main responsibility here at United Methodist Communications. And we work together. We work collaboratively around that. So it's a great experience. And I find that people who are in our churches don't always, understand the impact they make beyond their church and the things that happen, the lives that are touched all around the world, in places like Africa University and in work in the Philippines, places like Cambodia, and a number of different places where we really impact and touch lives and make an enormous difference because of this way we give. So anyway, it's a fun kind of additional part of my stewardship work.
Yeah, that's great. And so today I want to talk about generosity. What are some of the things that you tell congregations? You don't talk to congregations necessarily, but you talk to leaders who talk to congregations. But what are some things you encourage them to share with their congregations about living a life of generosity, a life of giving?
Well, in the groups that I get to speak to in workshops and whatever, there are a lot of these folks who are leaders, finance and stewardship leaders in local churches. And unfortunately, oftentimes we've become so focused in that work on the church's needs. How do we pay the church's bills? And what I'll say to folks is I'll say, well, stewardship and generosity is not about how do we pay the church's bills, though there is a component of what folks do in the local church that's important to fund mission and ministry. And I said, I make that distinction. It's not about paying the bills, but if you can tell people about the mission and ministry you're doing in a way that touches people's hearts, they respond in a generous way. And so I make that distinction between them. So there's that part of the work of stewardship, which is a very practical part. It's what involves a lot of churches in doing a full campaign or things like that.
Yeah, lots of churches are in the middle of that, probably as this releases.
Right. So your church may be involved in that. That's an important part. And hopefully in the process of that, your church is communicating to the members the difference that their generous giving makes. The other part of it is that our work is to make disciples of Jesus Christ, and that part of being a disciple, a faithful disciple, is growing in your generosity and your ability to reach out in compassion and help others. Just as our prayer life and our worship life and our service and those kind of things, we have people who profess their faith in Jesus, they want to follow Jesus, be a disciple. We ask them, will you support the church with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness? And the gifts part of that is a key part. So it's not just because the church needs that. It's because to be complete disciples, we need to get in touch with that part of our lives that calls us to be generous, that calls us to give because we've received so much.
Yeah, I was on the website, the stewardship portion of the Discipleship Ministries website, and the first word on that site is generosity, which to me is a whole shift in thinking about stewardship. And can you talk more about, like, when you talk about generosity and stewardship, what are you referring to?
Well, stewardship is a word that I think has kind of, and a lot of people have felt this, and I've kind of acknowledged this, that we have kind of misused it for that, to that extent of, how do we get the church's bills paid? In its broader sense, it's really about being called to take care of things that really don't belong to us. And so it comes out of that context of the fact of saying, God pours all these blessings down upon us, but they're really not ours to hold on to, they're ours to use and to share. And so it's a word I hope at some point that we can really recover more and kind of break it out of that mold of being about paying bills. And generosity is a word that we're using more and more because the joy is, I think people relate to it a lot easier. It usually connects with people, not with the idea of obligation or duty, which, is motivating less and less people. It connects them more with compassion and community and hope and ways in which inside of us we all want to do something that's going to make the world better, something that's going to touch somebody's life. Sometimes I'll kind of reflect with people about how good it feels for us at the holidays when we have the opportunity to give and be generous and give to other people. And if we can connect people with that good feeling around generosity, that feeling that most of us have, that you want to find something that really has meaning and impact, it touches, brings somebody joy. If you could touch with that feeling and say, there's a whole world of need around us that we can respond to, and that'll bring us that same kind of depth of joy and being generous in that way.
When you think about generosity as a spiritual discipline, how does it help us get in touch with God in our lives or the work of the Spirit?
Well, I think really at the heart of it is we don't move to that place until we get to an attitude, we get to a place of gratitude. We get in that place, and I kind of slipped up because when I worked with Norm Skank, actually, he had a sermon he preached, and it was basically, the line came from a guy who lived in Lakewood and told him you have to have an attitude of gratitude. And so I always have a tendency to kind of put those words together. And
Right.
Norm used to do that in his sermons and talk about the attitude of gratitude. But it really is important, is that when we begin to understand, to look at life, not in terms of how our glass or our portfolio could be fuller, but to begin to look at the things that we have and to be grateful for them. And that comes to people in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different ways that people will come in contact with that kind of feeling. So I think one of the ways that we open up generosity for people is when they begin to grow in that sense of gratitude, and they begin to find that ways. A lot of times we'll find, we'll connect with people who get joy out of generosity in an anonymous way. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that I want to do this because people will think highly of me. It's not going to be, going to do this so that, I'll get my name on a plaque somewhere. But in fact, people find incredible joy in just knowing that, because they've been blessed, Scripture says, we've been blessed to be a blessing. Because they've been blessed and they appreciate, they come out of the gratitude of that they find this great joy in saying, you know what, we can make a difference. Yeah. I talk a lot of times about UMCOM has kind of led this work that the whole denomination has done around trying to meet the needs of children with malaria in Africa.
Yeah, the Imagine No Malaria
campaign, and it's been an enormous success. Our people have responded generously to it, above and beyond all of the ministry shares and apportionment giving that's been done. But when I can sit and tell people that when we started that, first in that movement, probably back in about 2007, every 30 seconds a child was dying from malaria. And then I can say, the most recent thing I've heard is that every 2 minutes a child dies from malaria. That's an amazing thing to think about, that, there were 3,000 children a day dying from malaria, and now the number is more like 750. It's just incredible when people think that, we can make that kind of impact. And, there are children who are going to live today because, we raise that issue and people have been touched by it. So it's that kind of fact of saying, that we can give to help people who we will never meet, we'll never know who we are, but we can have that satisfaction of knowing that, whatever else goes on in my life, I know that I was a part of that. I know that I was a part of those lives that were saved. And so that to me is, that those are the kind of things that really kind of open up that life to people and say, and once you experience that, you want more of that.
Yeah, Imagine No Malaria is one of my favorite things, and it proves how we can, when we pool our resources in that way, we can take on huge problems.
Right.
And I think that's part of what we want on a smaller scale in the local church as well, is that when we pool our resources in that way, we can take on homelessness in our neighborhood or hunger or whatever those things are that we choose to do, and share with people the love of Christ.
Yeah, and this idea of generosity, I think for some times in our minds, and maybe it's kind of built into us when we're kind of starting out in our adult life, and we, most of us are kind of strapped, and you and I being, going into the ministry, we didn't go in because there were high salaries and all that stuff.
You don't do this for the money.
Exactly. So you kind of get into that mode, and I think it happens to a lot of, it'll happen to young people who, whether they go into ministry or not, coming into, into their working life, and they really are beginning to struggle. But the great thing about generosity is that it's not just for people who are wealthy. It's really, it's an opening to people that if you can kind of, in some cases people have been taught that through their families, and that's a wonderful thing. But if you can begin to explore that early in your life, you begin to see that, there are ways that are within the means of, all of us to experience that kind of joy. And it's really kind of a great opportunity. My dad worked real hard. He had a full career. He worked in business. He was in the Coast Guard Reserve, so he was out a couple of nights a week for the Coast Guard. He taught at a community college on Long Island at least 1 or 2 nights a week, and then he had his day job. But along the way, he found out that he was able to give a little bit, and I went to Drew University, my seminary up in New Jersey, and he discovered that his workplace would match gifts that he gave to the seminary 4 to 1.
Oh, wow.
And so if he were to give, a $100 gift, it wound up being a $500 gift. Or if he was able to come up with, 500, it was $2,500. Well, later in his life, after we were kind of grown up, I was the last one out of the house. He made that a kind of priority. And, now there's a scholarship that has his name on it at Drew for seminarians. Now, again, it's not a full scholarship, but it's a growing fund.
That's tremendous.
Yeah, and like I said, when after he died and my mom went into a nursing home, I had to clean out a lot of their records and things like that. And he died in 1997, but I don't think in his working career he ever made much more than $50,000 a year. But that opening was open to him, and he experienced that amazing joy. And that was not he was very faithful to his church and to a lot of other things, but he had the joy of knowing in his lifetime, he was never a wealthy man, but knowing that was a part. And that's his example to me. I mean, that's his legacy to me, not just that scholarship, and that I get a chance to meet sometimes last year I got a chance to actually meet the young woman who received his scholarship, but to know that that's part of my legacy, that generosity.
Yeah.
So I really invite people to explore it, because there are wonderful projects through the church that we have, through things like the Advance and stuff, that you can get into a little bit at a time. And it all begins with kind of that experience of gratitude.
A lot of times we don't think about it in that way. We're kind of conditioned to talk about what we don't have, what we lack. And I hear you saying that there's this spiritual attitude shifting from grateful for what I have rather than this longing for what I don't. Any tips on how you kind of make that shift?
Yeah, that's a key one. And again, it's really a question of kind of where your perspective is. For me, one of the ways that I have experienced that was I've had the opportunity to do some travel in the course of working for the church. Actually, I did a little more of it when I was in New Jersey, working on the conference staff than I have actually since I worked for the global church. But I had the opportunity to visit Liberia in West Africa. And it was in 2005. It was right around the time that they had just come out of years of civil war. I was in a country where the pastors that I met, I went for their annual conference session because it's a very strong United Methodist Church in Liberia in West Africa. And pastors who were in that church made maybe $30 a month when they got paid. But, oftentimes growing up, we saw these images of Africa that came to us of, hungry children and sad people and whatever. And, the truth is, I experienced more joy in the church in the week and a half that I spent in Liberia than I'd often had experienced in most of my growing up in churches in the U.S. I mean, the church was just so focused on the blessings that people had. And again, compared to us in terms of material things they had that filled their lives,
right?
You couldn't even begin to compare them. And yet they didn't need all that stuff to experience the great depth of gratitude and sharing. They were wonderful to us. They made sure, that we were there, that we had, food that we had and whatever. And even when people in annual conference there would walk 3 days to get to annual conference. They'd sleep on the floor of the church.
That's hard to imagine,
in New Jersey, I had people who'd complain about the hotel if the pillow wasn't right, or they got an apple in their lunch instead of a cookie. But, these folks would walk 3 days to come to annual conference, sleep on the floor of the church. And then we would sit down to these lunches and we would watch, them bringing an enormous pot of rice out to feed the members of the annual conference, which probably had, the equivalent of, one chicken for 100 people or whatever.
Right.
But they were so thrilled to be there, and they had that kind of sense. So for me, that was pretty eye-opening. It's whatever experience can give you some perspective on how blessed we really are, and sometimes I've known folks who've going through a disaster. We have places all over, Louisiana, South Carolina has been through floods, West Virginia. When you have the opportunity to know people who have come through these situations where they've lost everything, and they go through that experience, and then they begin to put their lives back together, or they're the recipients of other people's generosity, and they begin to realize, there's a lot of stuff that filled this house that I really didn't need. There's a lot of things we think we need. When it comes right down to it, if I have a dry place to sit and a bottle of water and a little bit to eat, I'm really in good shape. There's somebody else might need this more than me, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
That shifts your attitude and your outlook too. And so we have a lot of folks in our church who bring that perspective. I've had people say to me, we need to create a culture of generosity in the United Methodist Church. And I say, I think we have a culture of generosity in the church. One of the problems is I think we need to be better about inviting people into it, because a lot of times we're embarrassed to talk about our generosity. We're embarrassed to say the things we're doing. We think it's more like bragging, but we need to help people find a way of communicating the joy they get from being generous and sharing it with folks.
I want to talk a little bit, and I'm going back to the stewardship website, is you said generosity is a matter of action, intention, and heart.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting question, Joe, because my wife and I are attending a new church start. It's a church here in the Nashville area. It's doing really well. It meets in a school. But one of the things that amazes us about it is that the congregation is predominantly people under 30. It's a very much a church of millennials, and it's just an interesting experience for me, having been a pastor, for 35 years in ministry, 20 years in local churches, having started a new church 25 years ago or more now. It's just interesting to see the way this new church is evolving and attracting people like crazy. But anyway, last Sunday, our pastor spoke for the first time about giving. And he's talking about it. Basically, we haven't taken people into membership in the church, but he's kind of getting us set up for that. And he's talking about those 5 things, about prayers, presence, gifts, and service. And this was the week to talk about gifts. And yeah, he made jokes about people coming to church and talking about money. And this was the first time, and nobody was running for the door and all that. But one of the things that he challenged us to do was to be intentional about our giving. And he said, when I talked about prayer, he said, I talked to you about not just kind of putting prayer on our list, but being intentional about it and making it something that we really go after, that we think about and we do in a very intentional way. He says, nobody becomes generous by accident. They become generous because they've thought about it, they intend about it, and they take some intentional steps around it. So I think that's kind of where that comes from, is that idea that we have to put ourselves to the task of generosity and exploring that. And there's a scripture verse, and I think it's in the 3rd chapter of the book of Malachi, that speaks in terms of people's tithe. But he said, put God to the test and see if God won't open the windows of heaven and pour down blessings upon you. Sometimes that passage kind of gets used and kind of distorted to a prosperity gospel thing, that if we give, God's going to give us back more. And I think that God does that, not necessarily in terms of what is sometimes preached in terms of the blessing of things and money and possessions, but in terms of the joy that comes back to us. And so I think being intentional about it and inviting people to, kind of test out generosity in a way, and to see if it doesn't give you more back in terms of joy and generosity and those the kind of good feeling that comes from that, oftentimes more than the things we can spend our money on. We were talking about, I have an Apple Watch, which I really resisted buying, and I wound up buying it because I'm kind of a gadget kind of person. But the truth of the reality is that this money could have brought me a lot more joy if I had used it in a different way. And I know that, so I kind of keep reminding myself about that when it kind of looks at, what's the next thing that comes down the line that we want to go for? Is it really going to bring me the amount of joy that giving that money might give me?
That's a whole different way of looking at our stuff or our money.
Yeah.
Maybe is that how much joy is this going to bring me?
I may have said this already, but Jesus, talks more in the gospel about us. How do we live with our, possessions in a way that doesn't get in the way of our relationship with God? There are some great work that's been done recently around helping people do that kind of examination of their lives. Adam Hamilton did it in his book when he wrote Enough. Finding Joy and Contentment Through Simplicity.
Right.
There's a new book out that Cokesbury's published by Tom Berlin, who's a pastor in Virginia, who wrote a book called Defying Gravity. And he uses that image of gravity, what holds us to the earth. Well, oftentimes what we experience is that we're actually weighed down by the amount of stuff we have in our lives. And that, we can actually experience that kind of, I think it's in The Wiz that they have the song about, defying gravity, where when you begin to take all the weight off, you begin to experience. That's when they begin to experience flying in the musical. Yeah.
But I think it's Wicked, but
Wicked, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, it was in Wicked. But that's kind of what the premise of the book is, that, if we begin to kind of unload some of that stuff that's holding us down, it's not necessarily flying, but it's that lighter feeling of the fact that, we don't necessarily have to experience that sense of being controlled by how much stuff we have.
Whenever I've done a podcast on a spiritual discipline, intentionality comes up all the time. We talked about family devotions, and I was told, if you wait for a good time to do it, you'll never find the time. We did one on prayer, and it's if you wait till you have the time to pray, you don't have the time to pray. And the same thing I think is true with generosity. If you wait until there's extra money, that's not going to happen. So it's that idea of setting aside time, setting aside money, setting aside space sometimes for us in other areas. So it's a really intentional move, and I think that's a common theme.
Yeah, I spoke a little bit earlier about inviting people to be a part of the culture and being able to talk about generosity. And so, I will share this with you as a personal experience of what Bridget and I have experienced, is that we have 10% of our income, our pay, is transferred before we ever see it into an account. We call it our tithe account, but it could be our generosity account. And it's money that, it doesn't belong to us. It's for, we're kind of the stewards of it. We have the opportunity to give it away. So we give a portion of it to the church we're attending. We give a portion to it actually to the church that we were attending before. I give some back to a church, that I have a connection with in New Jersey. We have special things that are causes to us. And Africa University is the one that we have in our will. Africa University is remembered like a fifth child. Our kids understand that. I hope that we, if something happens to the both of us, our estate gets divided among those five, the four kids and Africa University.
Wow.
But, we kind of decided that, well, it's sort of silly because we won't live to see that happen. So we've decided that we wanted to start scholarship before we died. And so we don't have a lot of money to dispose, but $1,000 or $2,000 a year or whatever we're putting away, and when it reaches $10,000, it'll actually become a scholarship. And we've just decided that we want the joy of that, but it doesn't happen unless you have a plan for it. It doesn't happen. And for some folks, like I say, they make that connection with their local church. They may make that connection with a project that they see funded through places. But, again, it's something you have to set a goal on and be intentional, and not to wait until some time when we have excess money that we have to deal with or whatever, but to be intentional about saying, no, I want to experience that now. And so, when we look at the great things that are happening, at the work that United Methodists have done at Africa University, we look at it as stakeholders. We have that connection already. And it's not just because of what's going to happen when we die, but it's what we experience now in that generosity. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't happen unless we set our minds to say, this is something we want to experience. We want this to be part of our lives.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too that you've chosen the same path that your dad chose.
Yeah.
That's an interesting,
yeah.
That says something about mentoring and the ways in which I like your thought about inviting people into this. We do that with other areas of our lives, and with our spirituality, we might invite somebody into prayer or invite somebody into, and I think generosity is one of them. You are an example of that, kind of seeing what your dad has done.
And people, like I say, people need to learn. And like I say, if they learn, sometimes they'll learn through what we preach from the pulpit. More often than not, they'll learn it by becoming close to people who are living that out and seeing kind of from the sidelines the joy that they get from their generosity and from their giving. I think generosity kind of, it changes people's hearts.
Yeah, generosity, and it's a life. I mean, it's a whole lifestyle that I hear you saying. And so a couple of takeaways I have are set aside the time and the money to think about being generous. Invite other people into it. Don't be afraid to tell your story and the ways that generosity is doing great things for you. And then also, I think the other takeaway for me is the corporate generosity, that when we give kind of to the church, we can do even bigger things than we might be able to do individually. And then one more that just occurred to me as we were talking: no matter what I have enough, and I can use and I can give some of it away.
Absolutely.
So I could do this a lot longer, but we're running out of time. Thank you very much for being with us today and having this great conversation. We'll put some links on our website about places people can go, maybe to learn a little bit more if they want to go a little bit deeper. So we'll add those later.
Yeah, and there are, like I said, I mentioned a couple of books, but there are a lot more books that are out there that are not really geared towards, how do we fund the church's mission and ministry, but how do we understand this as part of what it means to be a whole disciple of Jesus, and really, beginning to get ourselves into those passages that Jesus taught and preached that really were about, how do we live with our possessions and our money in a way that doesn't interfere with our relationship with God, but puts us more in tune with God's will.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great.
It was great.
I want to say a special word of thanks to our special guests, our church leaders.
Clayton Smith, Executive Pastor of Generosity at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas.
Reverend Jenny Philip Allen, St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Reverend Lydia Munoz, Lead Pastor at Church of the Open Door in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania.
To learn more about the spiritual discipline of generosity, be sure to visit our website, umc.org/podcasts. Look for this episode of Get Your Spirit in Shape. We've put some links up to the books Ken mentioned and some other great resources that will certainly be helpful. Also, while you're there, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. There are several ways you can do it now. You can go through the iTunes Store, through the Google Play Store, and we've recently added Get Your Spirit in Shape to Stitcher. In December, we're going to be talking to Paul Chilcote about Charles Wesley's Christmas hymns and things we can learn through those hymns. Then in January, we have a very special interview with Science Mike of the Liturgist podcast, and author of a new book called Finding God in the Waves that I encourage you to find. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. As always, when you go to our site, you can email me to give us some ideas of things that you would like to hear more about, or to let us know how your spiritual disciplines are going. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon. Peace.